Hey everyone, welcome to The Retrospective, the engineering leadership podcast where we talk about topics for engineering manager that they face in their day-to-day jobs. With me here is Jeremy and I'm Peter. Let's get into it.
Hey Peter, it's great to be here today, and I'm really enjoying season 2 and the topics we're covering.
Same.
So for the listeners, just the way that we've been planning this season is that we've been taking turns bringing a topic each. So this week it's your topic. So what are you bringing today for us to talk about?
I have a nice, beautiful surprise for you, which is called tech debt. I think it's a favorite of a lot of engineers and engineering managers and probably business leaders also, not necessarily in a good way. We're not going to solve tech debt in 30 minutes, but what we can do is share our combined experience on the field. And let's talk about tech debt.
Yeah, I think it's a really timely topic, partly because a lot of companies I think we're in, we hear the end of zero interest. We hear a lot of focus on companies that are having to do more with less. There's a high pressure, especially in startup land, and a lot of pressure to ship more in a very competitive environment. Certainly that's something that I'm experiencing in my job. And at the same time, we have to manage this mystical thing called tech debt. And so I think it's a very timely topic for the period of time we're in right now.
Yeah, and another aspect why I think it's super timely is AI-assisted coding. I'm pretty sure that in every company there are a lot of code checked in the code base that was written by or with the huge assistance of AI. And if it doesn't work so well, that's going to increase your tech debt big way, and maybe not so obvious ways initially.
Actually, any interesting anecdote, Google said that 25% of code at Google is now written by AI. And
I was always skeptical about that number, like 25% of what? Like, sure, the line breaks, the prints, the returns, the functions. There is a lot of text in code that could be easily automatized.
I think it's autocomplete. I think it's just fancy autocomplete.
And I don't want to underplay. It's super useful autocomplete, but
Yeah, we've seen that. We're using an AI plugin called Codium, and it gives us stats and it says it's done 40% of coding for us. But I think most of it is just the fancy autocomplete that you were going to be doing anyway. It's kind of like autocomplete in Grammarly or in Gmail when it's completing sentences that you would have written anyway. And that's,
saving time, and as a side effect might increase your tech debt.
Exactly, because unintended things creep in. But so maybe if you can help us level set things a little bit, Peter, how would you define tech debt?
I actually thought a lot about that, and I came up with a long definition, long sentence, but I will unpack it. So my definition of tech debt is our past decisions' negative effect on the quality of our systems, limiting our options today. So there's 3 aspects to that. Past decisions, I wanted to capture that living with tech, you created tech debt. Tech debt is something that you live with today, but it was your past decisions that resulted in some tech debt. And I want to start here by explaining that those decisions probably made sense back then. You were optimizing for something and tech debt was least of your concern, or a smaller priority. So it's the effect of your past decisions. It's a negative effect on the quality of your systems. Quality, I mean in a very wide sense, and systems also. Quality can be the speed, the scalability, the code health in a lot of different ways. And systems can mean anything technical, your code, your infrastructure, maybe even your processes, CI/CD pipelines, tests, how you work. So your past decisions, negative effect on the quality of your systems. And I wanted to capture why tech debt is bad or what it means today. And this is what I came up with, is limiting your options today. You have a system full of tech debt. There are just less options. You can have, you cannot cut costs so easily. You cannot pivot to a different feature. You cannot re-architecture your system to today's needs so easily. So it's basically less options you have in what you're doing.
Yeah, I really like that definition, Peter, because we do need to on purpose take decisions. And in fact, tech debt can accumulate from very sensible decisions where we choose to build pragmatic architectures, not overbuilding for the
Yes.
future. And then over time, as things scale and grow, we need to constantly adjust for that.
Yeah, I like to think of it as a lever that engineering leaders can use strategically to balance between the quality, the cost, and maybe the velocity of the team. And sometimes you need to optimize for cost. Sometimes you need to optimize for speed. There is a business opportunity that you don't want to miss.
Mm.
And you cannot have it all. It's always a compromise. So you will need to compromise on the quality and increase the tech depth of your
Mhm.
systems. I like the mortgage analogy. You're taking out a big loan to be able to buy a house where you can live rent-free. Oftentimes it's a good decision, arguably, and it limits your options today. Maybe you cannot buy a new car for a year now. Maybe you cannot go on a big vacation for a while because you keep on have to pay back these monthly installments. So yeah, tech debt is not necessarily bad. The important thing is it should be conscious, the result of conscious decisions and not just happenstance and accidents.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm thinking about this also from explaining it to someone in the business. I think your mortgage analogy can work really well. I think another way to describe it is, you used an example earlier where we cut some corners to try and get something out the door fast.
Mm.
I was thinking about this one where you have a plumber that comes and fits a new sink, and they don't actually have all the pipes, so they fit something in cardboard. That's a very weird analogy, but we do this in tech.
Yeah,
But they fit some cardboard
reverse of
pipes and some tape stuff up, and that can work potentially temporarily, maybe not for too long. But if you increase the pressure or if you let it run for too long, then that's going to fail. And oftentimes, that's the kind of tech debt that we do. We build something just enough to ship, but then that cardboard needs to be replaced and put in real pipes and so on. And that's again the kind of classical approach to tech debt that we have.
Yeah, that's a good analogy because using cardboard piping, whatever that is, it's still better than having no pipes at all and having water coming off your sink to your feet and
Yeah, or potentially a sink that doesn't work for a bit, but you really need it.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Have you come across any other good ways to explain this to the business? Because I think one of the big challenges with tech debt is just actually explaining the concept to
Yeah,
business stakeholders and even users. Honestly, sometimes we have to explain to users why things are taking longer.
yeah. No, I think any approach works that can connect the limited options that I was talking about in the definition to the business dictionary. We have limited options in quality. Stakeholders will feel the pain when it takes 2 days to get back from an incident as a result of some tech debt in your processes on pipelines or infrastructure, for example. Stakeholders don't care about the code health, the duplications, the redundancy, everything that makes code problematic. But they do care about quality. They do care about costs. They do care about user satisfaction. You as an engineering manager, the listener of this podcast, your job is to translate between these stakeholders and engineering and make the connection, the impact of tech that in the business goals and outcomes.
Yeah, I really like that. Just connect the lack of options you have today and the negative effect that past decisions had on the quality, and explain that using different analogies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
and it's a discussion. Like a lot of engineering managers face these challenges. I need to convince leadership to give me permission to address tech debt. That's a bad mindset. You as an engineering manager should pay attention also when you're doing these discussions with stakeholders on the business side. So you can also understand better the priorities. If the business is in a big cost-cutting exercise, you can tie your tech debt initiative to that and focus on the infrastructure maybe where you can decommission some old services by moving them to
Yeah,
newer ones and save some money. It's not a fight, it's a discussion between the business and
absolutely.
the engineering side.
Yeah, I agree. So how, as a team, when you're a team, how do you tell when you have too much tech debt? How do you measure? How do you detect it? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I really like that you use the word measure, because talking about data is much more productive than talking about feelings and beliefs. I'm pretty sure that there are a lot of engineers who are very frustrated about tech debt with the code they work
Mm.
with. But some of those people will probably struggle if they have to point to some numbers, what they mean by tech debt exactly. So fortunately, we have a lot of good metrics in the industry that can be used and satisfy the need to connect this assessment to business, what we were talking about. The DORA metrics can come at hand, a pretty big industry standard by now, end of 2024, when we are talking about this, especially metrics like the lead time for changes or failure rate, or something that can tell a lot about the system, the time to restore service. I really like this metric because there are a lot of things that can impact this metric, and a lot of those are tied to tech debts in various parts of your system's infrastructure, code, or processes. So you can use DORA metrics. You can be more direct and measure some quality metrics, number of bugs or number of new bugs created in the last 3 months, response times of your systems, like more performance metrics. It really depends on the organization. What are the goals of your organization? What is the business trying to achieve? And finding those metrics and bringing in some tech debt aspect can help.
Yeah, I think the other part for me is toil, the not fun stuff that you have to do. And I have a really great example of this.
Mm.
There was a infrastructure engineer in one of the companies I worked at where we had a very manual process to deploy the
Mm.
application. And he recorded a video of what the deployment process was, and there was over 300 clicks and manual
Wow.
things taken to get a whole thing live. And obviously, that was to explain what was needed to be done and it show very vividly the tech debt. And obviously, we invested heavily in automation, and we got to the point where it was just click a button and that whole thing was done automatically.
That's so
So
good. I really
yeah.
love that story. The tool this engineer was using, recording themselves
Mhm.
doing this actual process, it's very powerful. And yeah, I don't need to say it, but those are 300 ways this process can break. I'm pretty sure there were a few occasions when some of those broke. And
All the time.
yeah,
Because how do you remember? And that process was already an improvement because the original one, when that company was acquired, the first time it was all deployed from one person's laptop. So at least
oh wow.
the process that he videoed was being able to be run from multiple places. But
You virtualize that guy's laptop?
no, but yeah, I mean, you just invest. Yeah, I think sometimes it's really, really obvious. It's like the elephant, and sometimes it's less obvious. So depending on the situation, you have different kind of ways of checking and tracking it.
Yeah, it's important you say sometimes it's really obvious. Of course it is for an engineer. And I would say even for a non-engineered leader, seeing that video of that 300 steps that it takes to deploy the application, it's very obvious. They will say, oh my God, I feel your pain. I promise you, we are done with this sales cycle. We are done with the next product launch. But they don't actually feel the impact on the business,
Mm.
because what they are walking away from the demonstration is that, oh, poor Joe, he has to go through 300 steps every day. That's not the impact. The impact is all the ways this can break,
Mhm.
and all the ways you will struggle to release a new feature when something is changing in this process. And that's what the business feels, that the users don't get the new feature, features take longer, features are buggy, incidents are happening. So I would say even when it's obvious, think about the users of your systems and the business stakeholders, and make it obvious for them the
Mhm.
pain, what the option limitations are.
And actually, in this case, the users and were being impacted because things would go wrong in that process, as you say, and there were regularly fires. So that was easy. It was an easy
Yeah.
sell.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Those are the obvious situations. But what
Yeah.
about in a situation where it's less obvious and there's more of a disagreement about tech debt, how do
Mm.
you come to an agreement then inside a team or between a team and its stakeholders that you need to invest on tech debt, or that it's acceptable to leave it as it is?
That's a really good point because we were talking about convincing the business, but oftentimes you need to convince your engineering peers that we should address this type debt and not that type debt. What you can do is, I like to think in teams and not in individuals. So in this case, I would suggest to practice something like a tech debt tour, like every other sprint or some regular occurrences. You pick a different engineer and they hold a short 15-minute walkthrough of the part of the code base or the part of the process or infrastructure that they are most concerned about. They explain, just like this 300-step video, that's a perfect example for this. I would do this first in the team to build a shared understanding of the challenges so others can feel the pain and chime in. And second, give everyone a voice in the process. Maybe someone in the team can come up with a better way to do this, or they can pile up on that saying that, oh, wait, this exact problem that you're struggling with, I have the same problem in my code base. Maybe we could address this together. So elevating the understanding and the knowledge of the team with these regular tech debt tours, I think it can be a good first step to create alignment on the engineering side that this is the most impactful or most urgent thing that we want to address in the next time. And then you can tie it to the business goals and see
Yeah.
the impact.
Now, for me, I think it's really important when we talk about the team here, the product manager is involved in that, because often I think engineers can quickly see and agree on things when it's made more visible like that. But the product manager is probably caring less about the tech debt, and they still have a lot of the concerns of the business. And it's super important that they understand the impact on the team to
Yeah.
be able to protect the team when you take a decision to work on tech debt. And they need to be part of that group as well.
I totally agree, and thanks for bringing this up. I'm a bit biased because I was leading platform engineering teams most recently, and I didn't have product managers in my teams. I had a very good product partner on the domain level, but it's super important what you're saying to include the product side in this alignment of seeing the problem, because oftentimes when priorities are decided, you're not even going to be in that room. It's the product manager of the team who's going to have to fight for the engineering side also
Mhm.
to make the pain visible and get some leadership buy-in and stakeholder buy-in to address some of the tech debt. So
Yeah.
definitely include the PM in these discussions.
Yeah. And I think going back to the point you made earlier about data and measuring and so on, the data bit is really important. In the past, we've done things like measuring the types of work or the signals of not having invested on tech debt, like whether it's an increase in bugs and some of the other metrics that you mentioned earlier. But I think those are important signals as part of this discussion about aligning on tech debt and what to
Yeah,
do.
and they can be very powerful because they bring the discussion to principles to how we want to operate. For example, if you manage to track where you're spending your time, is it feature development, unplanned work, and then the organization can have an ideal and say, okay, I want to spend just numbers 80% of time on feature development and 20% or everything else. And you come back with metrics and say, in the last 2 quarters, we could only spend 60% of time on feature development. And that's the impact of the tech that we are having. So we would like to double down on that in the next quarter so we can get this amount of time closer to the ideal 80% that we set as a goal as an organization. Again, you're bringing the discussion to talk about interpreting data and impacting data, and not about philosophies like code should be beautiful and I don't know, all
Yeah,
kind of approaches that are not useful in business discussions.
exactly. I would say the classic thing that a product manager or business person will do is say,
Yeah,
listen, I just need you to deliver these features.
promise
And,
you the
uh,
last one.
and I promise you, I just need it for this next 6 months because it's super crucial for our business right now. And then we can do some of those other projects that you talked about. But no, we can't do those and we need to do this. And then 6 months later, business is still in a crunch and the platform starts to burn more, but you need to continue. So that starts to make me think about what are good strategies for managing tech debt. Are
Yeah.
there different approaches? What would you recommend, Peter?
I mean, first of all, let's separate the two kinds of tech debt or two kinds of activities managing tech debt. One is the day to day when you, you have a fairly healthy system. You have some issues you want to have to deal with, but your house is not on fire. So this is a critical stage because you need to maintain this and maybe gradually improve this. One approach I found useful in these situations is pairing tech debt work with feature development. It's basically, there is this, I think it's from the Boy Scouts, that leave your camping site cleaner than you found. I think it applies to code and everything you as an engineering team touch. Like if you develop a feature about, I don't know, newsletters, then take a look at how email sending is implemented and maybe refactor it slightly to make it healthier. Do some small refactors that are adapting it better to today's needs compared to yesterday's needs. So pairing this work with feature development has two big benefits. One is that you're in the context and mindset of that current feature. You don't need to dig through documentation. What is it that we are doing here? Oftentimes, code is your documentation and nobody knows why we are doing things the way we are doing it, but that's how it's implemented in the code. If you're touching a feature like this that has a lot of historical parts implemented, you can discuss with your product manager and remove some of those while doing the feature development. So that's one of the benefits. The other one is just practicality. Like you don't need to start a separate project. You don't need to get leadership buy-in. You just estimate a little bit longer for the completion of the feature because you keep in mind that you need to leave behind a healthier and more solid and more flexible code base than what you started with. So yeah, pair feature development with tech debt work it requires a lot of discipline, but it can be very efficient.
Yeah, I think the discipline is to let the scope creep of the tech debt refactoring overtake too much the
Oh yeah,
situation.
big risk.
Um, but I mean, I've seen a really good example of that recently where a staff engineer was working in the code base. They found some part of it that had a lot of toil to update versions. And
Mhm.
so they improved how we used the Renovate bot to better do that in the future, plus fixing debt as you go approach.
Yeah, yeah. Now you mentioned risks, and it's very important getting carried away and refactoring stuff that are not necessarily in the scope, and then you didn't deliver the feature, but you're already 2 weeks late. And
Mhm.
the other risk I would say is premature optimization. It's when you think that, oh, there is this new feature, newsletter sending. Maybe I should have a separate service that handles emails, and maybe I should have it done with an auto-scaling microservices infrastructure. And then you start working on those. And then next week, the product decision is that actually we're just going to use a third party for newsletters because it scales better. And all those premature optimizations was a waste of time. So keep the
Exactly.
scope, only solve today's problems, but still pair the tech debt work with future development.
It's really funny because I really like this example you just used, the newsletter ending thing, because that's a really good pragmatic decision. It should be made like that in most situations. But the funny thing is that might become tech debt later when you realize that um, I know we're not going to use that external service and we're
Yeah,
going to need to scale it more. And that's perfect. Then that's a good moment to work on changing it. So that's just a good example of how you make a
exactly.
good choice now, and then it's just a loop. You improve later. You'll need to improve it later.
Yeah, you cannot solve tomorrow's problems because you don't know tomorrow's context. This is exactly why you need to deliver stuff quickly to get the validation and feedback from your users. And those information will affect your decisions tomorrow. And maybe you will double down on in-house built infrastructure. Maybe you will pivot to external. I don't know. Nobody knows. That's the point. You just solve today's problems.
Exactly. Now, those are all the kind of like the small
Yeah,
ongoing
let's go
things.
to the big one.
Yeah. But sometimes you have something really big, like that example of the manual deployment process or others. How do you handle those?
I read it I think in one of Will Larson's books, is that the only solid, reliable way in these situations is a migration to a new system. There is a point where your old code base, your old system is just so hard to work with, so ridden with tech debt, that it's easier to throw everything out and start from scratch. Now, this is not how you should do it, and we can talk about how you should migrate to a new system. But the goal should be this. You leave behind the old mess because you save a lot of time trying to discover why is it working like that? What are the features that are still needed? What is not? It's easier to move on to a new system from scratch.
So I have two questions when you say that. One is, how do I know that I need to migrate? Because I've seen cases where people have migrated or done a rewrite when they absolutely did not need to do it.
Yeah, I really don't like the rewrite word, to be honest, because I find it a less senior pattern that when I'm facing a problem, I'm pretty sure everyone wrote their ideal to-do application or commenting system and everything. And you don't, yeah, I don't like the rewrite word. But to answer your question, this is why we have good engineers. And I hear myself that this is not a satisfactory answer, but there are points where you can see that the system needs to move on. Maybe the way I can answer this is the technique of how I think you should do this kind of migrations. You know the strangler fig pattern. Those of us who are listening might not be familiar. The concept is coming from biology about some kind of plants. The point of it is that you isolate parts in your system. You have a big, complex, interconnected system, and you isolate a part in it that has less connections, ideally, with the rest of the system. You make those connections very clear, and within this isolation, within this isolated part of the system, you do some refactoring that the rest of the system doesn't see happening. So if you take this approach, what you get is that you can basically work in a live system. You avoid this big boom migration when you say that, okay, on Monday we start the new system, we shut down the old one, and there is 2 weeks of fires everywhere. You have a much more scalable and reliable migration process. You also increase your confidence in the quality of the system, because isolating those connections between the system you selected and the rest of it, the best way to do it is to write a lot of tests to ensure that your system is still returning the stuff that the rest of it is requiring. And once you're done with that, you have those tests in your CI/CD pipelines every time you make a change. And then maybe you don't even need to decide if it's just a small refactoring or if it's an entire rewrite, because it's rarely very binary. Oftentimes it's a scale. So maybe you can do like, you isolated one system, you rewrote it in the modern way that you want, you isolated another, rewrote it, and you reach a point where 80% of your system is so-called modern. I don't want to get into deeper what is that, but you see what I mean. And 20% is still the old one, and maybe you're fine with that. Like maybe that 20%, it doesn't worth the effort to address. The majority of your system is fine, and maybe you will decommission it in 2 years or whatever. So actually, I think this is a good way to look at this. Instead of rewrite everything from scratch, you take parts, isolate it, and migrate those little parts one by one. Keep on evaluating if you still need to pay attention to tech debt, or you reach the point where it's okay to live with.
Yeah, I think that I can probably list some bad reasons why you shouldn't do it. I have some examples. There was at one stage we had a PHP backend with a modern JavaScript front end. The PHP backend was actually very well written, structured, a lot of tests, thousands of tests. Things were fast. CI was really good. And the new CTO, who knew Python but didn't know PHP, he didn't learn. And there were challenges with that PHP backend, but he decided that he wanted to rewrite the backend in Python. And that's a total reskilling of it. And then what was really funny was the CTO decided that they didn't like Vue, which the front end was in. So redid the front end in React. Those are the wrong reasons to rewrite things.
Yeah.
I mean, there could be some valid business reasons to do that. But in those cases, I really felt like having known that system and worked in it, and then seeing those decisions after, I lived with things that I felt were suboptimal, but I focus on the business value, whereas those rewrites generated very little value for the business and obviously it distracted the team significantly.
This is why it's very useful to connecting back to our earlier point is that you talk about tech debt, you should talk about the options it's limiting you and the business outcomes and how it's painful and hurtful for the business to live with this tech debt every day. In your example, maybe I'm over assuming, but I think what your team was optimizing for is the comfort of the CTO with the tech stack. And that's not something you spend months and months of developers' time and engineering time to optimize for. And switching both front end and back end, the whole stack, it's super risky and super expensive. And sometimes that's a good solution. Like if your product was pivoting a lot and you're doing very differently, then maybe that's a good opportunity to change that also.
I do think there has to be a real business value justification for changing
That
tech
should
stack.
be everything. That should drive these decisions because ultimately the goal of the company is to make money. Everything else is just a means to those ends.
Exactly. So thinking more tactically, our podcast is really targeting engineering managers.
Yeah, got
What
philosophical there.
Yeah. What advice and how would you recommend engineers decide what tech debt
Yeah,
to tackle in the sprint they're planning at the moment or, the next month ahead? How should they prioritize that?
yeah. That's I like that a lot of stuff that you don't mention in this question, which is implied, which is great. Like there is a healthy process of every sprint tackling some of the tech debt, and this is what I want to make explicit that that's a way for a sustainable tech debt management. And the other thing that you're implying is that there is engineering understanding of the tasks that we need to tackle. So this is a great point. And now comes the big question, okay, which one of the fires do we turn our attention to? And it's basically a decision-making exercise, and there are a lot of tools that can work. One very simple one that I can explain and I think is adaptable well here is the Eisenhower matrix for decision-making. It's a 2 by 2 grid. On the horizontal axis, you have urgency. On the vertical, you have impact. And then you can group your tasks into these 4 quadrants. You're going to have urgent but not impactful tasks. You're going to have impactful but not urgent tasks. And then you're going to have urgent and impactful and not urgent, not
Mhm.
impactful. My point is that you should have a portfolio approach because the big risk is that you want to avoid that you always pay attention to the urgent stuff because you feel the pain now and you always deprioritize the impactful non-urgent ones.
Mhm.
For example, if let's say one of your third-party providers, an authentication system or something very core level that you're using, they send you an email that in 1 way, we're going to move to a different version that will have some new API commands and we're going to have to deprecate some of the current ones that you're using. It's not urgent at all. You have a year to think about this, but it's going to be super impactful if you don't meet these deadlines and you're not ready with your the API by then. So my advice is a portfolio approach. Make sure that, for example, every quarter you tackle some of the impactful tasks that you have and then balance it with the urgent ones. Also, this framework helps to realize that there are some tech debts that are not urgent and not impactful, like, I don't know, code styling, tabs versus spaces, this kind of stuff.
Mhm.
Maybe you can just defer them to a hackathon or some backlog of things we might address one day, not put too much effort in it.
Mhm. I like that. And I think there's this kind of balancing approach that you described between features and tech debt and choosing which ones to do. And there's another approach, which is like the kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs
Mm,
pyramid approach, which pairs well with kind of a zero bugs approach,
mm,
which is essentially on the bottom of your foundation is things like security and compliance and so on. So anytime that you have something that, is not secure or updating a library or whatever, you do all of those things first. And then you do things that affect reliability and stability, performance. And then it's only when you're pyramid is stable, and then you do the top parts,
Mhm.
delivering value to the users as in new functionality or functionality that helps the business grow. And I think there's no one right approach. I do have a personal preference for the kind of zero bugs pyramid approach. I really hate carrying stuff in the backlog. Maybe I also hate backlogs. Read another topic for another day, but
Yeah.
managing bugs and so on. But I really think if say you're going to do it, shouldn't keep it on the long finger, as we say in Ireland. It's like you keep it somewhere far away, reminding yourself that you need to do it, but you never get to it. So I really like this kind of pyramid prioritization approach.
But
But I
like,
think
talk a bit about this. Like you're working with a system that has a lot of ancient stuff, a lot of things that maybe you will decommission later. You have 359 bugs in your ticket systems. How do you implement this system where your foundation is always in a good place, and before that's solid, you don't do anything else on the upper levels?
so. The ideal scenario for this is when you're building, like in a startup, you start like this and you continue like this,
Mm,
and you're able to maintain the pyramid in a stable way, right? Um, and that's how the best approach is. But then in the situation you're describing, which is a lot more legacy and debt,
yeah.
that then you need to see this as the direction you want to end up in, and you need to work your way towards that, making those migrations and all the different choices towards that. Like the scenario I was in where I used that example about the manual deployments. And so
Yeah.
we carved out time to get to deployments to be automated. And this is like an 18 months, 2 year process to get to a different, more stable
Mm,
part. And different bits of your system will arrive at different points in time into that place where you can operate with a zero bugs approach in that area. You also are going to have a tolerance for more known issues potentially, and just have
yes.
them more documented. Like just the whole way that you approach things. We talked about gardening and thinking in the future and stuff. That's what you want senior people to do, is map a route to this place. What is not acceptable is staying in that
Mm.
rocky tech debt situation with lots of fires constantly happening.
Yeah, yeah, I like that you brought up the startup approach, because they seem like they have the luxury of a greenfield project and they can set all those foundation levels and pay attention. But oftentimes startups, they say that our only goal is to survive till we can validate our MVP or have a product market fit, and everything else is secondary. And I don't care about uptime, or I don't care about anything. So those works against the foundation. But I think how you can resolve this conflict is focusing on making the foundation very minimal. What are the few handful of key differentiators that you don't compromise on? For example, in a security company, the protection of your users' data. Whatever product experiments you're doing in a desperate attempt to get some funding or validation, you don't compromise that. That's the foundation. And if there are problems on that area, you throw away everything and fix those first. So I think a good way to implement this pyramid approach, which I really like, is to spend some time and don't get too optimistic about what you put on the lower levels and just the key stuff.
Yeah, well, obviously in that startup place, the danger that people do in those startup scenarios is they build too many things. So I think you should outsource a lot to SaaS,
Yes.
and not try and build and run on. I've written a blog post about don't use Kubernetes in those situations unless there's a specific reason why you really need to use it. Use, I don't know, fly.io or one of these other platform as a service
Yes.
offerings. Minimize what you do to focus on the value that you can really add. Outsource all the undifferentiated heavy lifting. At some point in the future, if you're successful, you might need to bring some of those in-house to actually start to differentiate. But this is where a lot of tech debt is accumulated in companies, because they overbuild in the early stages and they make their surface area of the product too big.
Yeah.
Um,
I was on a meetup recently when a failed startup founder shared their learnings. It was amazing. It was very honest and very good. They were saying the same stuff, like outsource whatever you can, focus on your core differentiator. be very comfortable with manual work also. Like it was some sports race video app, whatever. The founder was manually editing videos for their subscribers because they didn't want to invest to any kind of automation there too early. And the concept they brought in was similar to minimum viable product, is the MVB, the minimum viable business.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what the startup focuses on, only to get the validation, try out all the experiments and see what sticks. Investing in a solid architecture in this period is a waste of time 99% of the time, because you don't know what your company is going to do.
So this is it.
We went a bit off
No, but I
rails.
think it's really interesting because this loops back to what you said at the very beginning describing tech debt. And as we summarize things, I really like how you said the past decisions, and we talked about how the earlier and better the decisions you can make, the quality will be better and you'll have more options in the future.
Yeah.
And so I'd love for you to kind of wrap up this whole thing going down to the engineering manager level.
Okay, so takeaways. Don't talk about tech debt in the engineering context only. Talk about it in the business context. Make the business pain visible to stakeholders. Understand that tech debt is okay, some level of tech debt, learn how to live with it, but have a plan how you're going to address it and how you're going to get out of it. Data, if you're talking about data, things you measure, time spent at various areas, incident numbers, everything, you're arguing about where you want your team and your organization to be, and not about what you believe is good code or bad code. And a healthy culture, you should have disagreements in your teams, but you should resolve those disagreements on the engineering side about what is really a tech debt and what are your plans to address it. And finally, some balanced approach to prioritization. Don't go into half a year, we stop every feature development kind of refactorings, because those very rarely work out well in my experience.
Yeah. Just a tip, a sign, if you know you're doing it well, the product manager is the one that prioritizes working on tech debt because you've made it visible enough. The business is recognizing the need to invest in it.
I love that. If you have a good relationship with your PM and you manage to convince them that it's going to hurt them if we don't address this tech debt, or you manage to find a way to pair it with the feature work, then you won. Then basically you can do it.
Yeah, brilliant. Great topic, Peter. Thanks very much. And to our listeners, thank you. Would love some feedback and really appreciate some of the messages we've had in from some of the last episodes. Of course, it would be great if you fed the algorithms to help us be more visible. But more than anything, it would really appreciate if you found this valuable, that you would share it with others that you think might appreciate what we're talking about today.
Yeah, thank you very much. And see you or talk to you in 2 weeks.
Awesome. Yeah.
Bye.